Ladies and gentlemen, gender nonconforming and trans deities, thank you for tuning in to the Hoodoisie. We are Chicago and the country's only live and live stream radical news show on culture and politics, disseminating Black optic and radical perspectives on culture and politics. I'm your host, Ricardo Gamboa, and you are now watching or in the Hoodoisie's teach-in series, Liberation in Black and Tan. So as many of you know, this teaching series was something me and the team threw together in response to the eruption of Black and brown racial tensions and brown on Black violence in the wake of George Floyd protests. And we are so excited to bring in Latinx professors from across the country to our audience here in Chicago and also across the country to break down some of the topics that were underpinning that movement, as well as help us think on how we can move forward. So I'm done talking, because I do it too much, and I'm just a pretty face with a dimple chin. But I do want to get into this next session, which is between antagonism and co-imagining, understanding Black-Brown relations. And it is taught by an awesome professor. She is the Collins Professor of Indigenous, Race and Ethnic Studies and Geography at the University of Oregon, where she studies race, activism, environmental justice, and cultural memory. She came to Oregon from California, where she was immersed in struggles for economic, racial, and environmental justice in LA. So here's a shout out to all my Little Village environmental justice organizations and Southeast Chicago moms that have been holding it down for environmental justice. I thought you all would extra appreciate this guest. She's also authored numerous books, including Environmentalism for Economic Justice, Two Chicano Struggles in the Southwest, Black, Brown, Yellow, and Left Radical Activism in Los Angeles, and People's Guide to Los Angeles, among others. And currently she's working on a historical atlas of the foundational white supremacy. She is Laura Pulido, and let's give it up for Laura with all your hand clap emojis, or likes, or hearts, or care emojis, whatever you want. And I'll let Laura take it away from here.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be here with you today. I'm delighted to be part of this larger conversation. I think it's always important to talk about the relationships between Black and brown peoples, but especially at this watershed moment. I know that in this teach-in, there have been presentations on Black and brown solidarity, Mexicans in the U.S. racial formation, and Latinx and anti-Blackness. I have been asked to speak specifically on different kinds of relationships between Black and brown people, including conflict, cooperation, and how we co-imagine together, even when we don't always realize it. I want to thank Ricardo for organizing this teach-in. I think that understanding dynamics between various people of color is incredibly important for building movements for racial justice. This is something that the mainstream press really rarely covers. And when it does, it's treated in a very superficial fashion. I know, for example, today on NPR, there was a discussion with both a Latinx and an Asian American, two guys, around how these different populations are kind of intersecting or engaging in this moment. And it was actually, she was questioned like, do you have any role? Or people even suggesting like, we don't have a role. And it's just like, that's like so crazy. So I think it's really important that we dig in, because if you think about it, I think racial solidarity among people of color is one of the keys to achieving racial justice in the United States. Most of the attention is focused on the Black-white binary, as we have seen the last several weeks, which is certainly very important. But if Black, Indigenous, and people of color could unite, we could effectively challenge white supremacy. Now, I have no illusions that all Black and brown people would unite, or even a majority, but that's okay. We only need an organized, vocal minority. I think the white supremacists say you only need 3% to make a revolution. What we need is people who are willing and able to offer a different framework to their families and communities, an explicitly anti-racist one. We need people willing to acknowledge and work through the differences, disagreements, and points of unity. And with a shift in consciousness, as well as an oppositional activist infrastructure, I think we could have a major impact. It was my desire to understand all these dynamics that led me to study racial activism and interethnic relations for the last 30 years. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to share one of my research projects with you, in which I examine how Black and brown people co-imagine political futures. I argue that neat definitions of Black and or Latinx activism are overly simplistic. And if we look closely, we can see all kinds of connections. Because in fact, we shape each other in ways both large and small through co-imagining. So what I'm going to do first is talk about different models for understanding relationships between African Americans and Latinx peoples, including conflict and competition, cooperation, and then co-imagining. As part of the co-imagining, I will share some maps on the geography and history of brown and black exchanges that I have documented in the United States. So let me begin with some of the ways that scholars have conceptualized black and brown relationships, beginning with conflict. Before I do that, I want to offer a caveat. I am treating Latinx and African Americans as two separate categories, which overlooks, of course, the experience of Afro-Latinx peoples and communities. This is a weakness, I think, in my work, which I was not able to address 5 years ago when I collected this data. Nevertheless, I hope this talk encourages us to rethink some of these conventional boundaries in multiple kinds of ways. Now, one of the oldest approaches to studying relationships between African Americans and Latinx peoples, especially Mexicans, is competition and conflict. And this became very popular in the 1980s as the Latinx population began exploding. Basically, competition and conflict are two ways of understanding hostility and tensions between these two groups of peoples. So, as the name implies, competition is the idea that Latinxes and African Americans, as the two leading minority groups, are competing with each other. They're competing for political power, jobs, limited state resources, white respect, genuine membership in the nation, competing for who is the most aggrieved, competing for the position of civil rights leaders. And for example, I think the book of Nicholas Vaca is a wonderful example of that. Much of the competition argument is rooted in demographics. African Americans have been, of course, the largest racial minority or minoritized population for centuries, and thus have attracted far more attention historically. And now Latinxes are the largest group. Some refer to this demographic change as the Latino tsunami or the browning of America. Critics of this approach call it demographic determinism. And they argue, just because you have the numbers does not mean you're destined to dominate. And I actually think that's true. Besides numbers, the Black experience is, historically Black numbers, the Black experience is central to all of the US. In contrast, I think until relatively recently, the Latinx experience has been smaller, more regional, and as well as diverse. It's important to understand that it's precisely the centrality of the Black experience that has also led to competition. Latinxes often feel and resent that they are in the shadow of African Americans. The Black experience often defines things, and Latinxes are supposed to somehow fit into that racial framework, when in fact we may have our own reality. Now, related to competition is conflict. And sometimes conflict stems from competition, but not always. For example, we know that some Latinx people are anti-Black. And it's important to understand that although anti-Blackness is universal, its specificity is shaped by geography and history. Consequently, we can point to several distinct racial processes that animate Latinx anti-Blackness. One, of course, is the white supremacy emanating from Latin America, which came with European colonization. And many immigrants bring this with them when they come to the United States. But even without Latinx immigration, we see within the US racial formation itself, going back to the annexation of Mexico in 1848, Latinx people have a particular position in the US racial structure as part of what has been often called the racial middle. And I think Josie Saldana talked about this yesterday. A third dynamic, which kind of bridges the two, is when Latinx people, like other immigrants, wish to become American by subordinating Black people. And this has been one of the key ways in which many immigrant groups, such as the Irish, Italians, become white, right, through embracing white supremacy. This is very clearly a form of white supremacy insofar as when Latinx immigrants do it, they are reproducing a racist structure in which Black people are at the bottom, and obviously whiteness is validated. In other cases, Latinx people more directly aspire to whiteness. This likely comes from the Latin American overvaluation of whiteness, as well as the denigration of indigeneity and Blackness. And if you come from, I can only speak for myself, coming from a Mexican background, which I heard all the time about, blancas versus the morenos and the different kinds of, clearly aspiration of evaluation of whiteness. One example of Latinx white supremacy comes from LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens. Through much of the 20th century, LULAC leaders in Texas resisted efforts to categorize Mexicans as colored or non-white. Local health authorities had begun categorizing Mexicans as colored in the 1930s. But LULAC insisted that they were white and therefore subject to all the privileges of white people. So instead of challenging the racial hierarchy, LULAC bought into white supremacy to improve their own position, while further subordinating their Black brothers and sisters. Thankfully, that has changed, but that gives you an idea of what some Latinx people have done in the past. And we can point to many other sources of evidence of this, such as certainly survey data. I think when we look at the extent to which Latinx people are supporting Black struggles, there are always some, but it's a really, really small minority that we can point to. We can think about Latinx police officers and their abuse and violence towards Black civilians, right? There's many different spheres, I think, in which this exists. There has also been conflict and hostility on the part of some African Americans toward Latinx people, especially immigrants. During the 1990s, there was a major rise in anti-immigrant sentiment, and this was epitomized, arguably, by Proposition 187 in California. This was an effort that would have banned immigrants from many social and health services in the state. And it was so popular, it was replicated in many states and actually then also became part of federal policy. While many Black people opposed such attacks, numerous high-profile people actually advocated for it. This included Jamal Shaw's family, who used his death as a rallying point for anti-immigration policy. In 2008, high school senior Jamal Shaw was murdered by Pedro Espinosa, an unauthorized immigrant. His distraught family, working with anti-immigrant forces, became proof of how Black people were hurt by immigration and that anti-immigrant activists were not racist. So this was really important in thinking about the kind of ideological work that Black bodies performed in terms of bolstering the position of white anti-immigrant activists. Together, they wrote Jamil's Law, which sought to rescind Special Order 40. And Special Order 40 was very important because what it did is it prohibited law enforcement from inquiring about immigration status whenever they questioned somebody. So clearly this was an effort to reduce deportations. Black radio personalities, Black politicians, and some Black activists took up this cause, right? And 10 years later, we can see the Shaw family, and they are still actively supporting Trump and have appeared in numerous commercials for him as well as speaking at his rallies. Now, I don't want to suggest that these two forms of hostility are equal, because I don't think they are. I think Latinx people have engaged in white supremacy far more than Black people have been anti-immigrant. We have repeatedly shown our willingness to buy into white supremacy, either as a way of addressing discrimination or to create more opportunity for ourselves. Regardless, I think the roots of this conflict are the same. It is precipitated by a desire for inclusion in the nation and inclusion in whiteness. And inclusion is desired because of systematic exclusion and subordination. So I think it's very important when we think about a lot of our political strategies, in that so often they are about inclusion without questioning what we are trying to buy our way into or get our way into. Now, the flip side of conflict competition is solidarity and cooperation. Numerous scholars point to the long history of solidarity between the two groups, especially Mexicans, which we can trace back to at least the 1800s, when Mexico, for example, offered a safe haven to Black slaves. And I know Paul Ortiz discussed some of this in history yesterday, so I won't spend too long on it. In addition to the various movements he discussed, scholars have analyzed deep cultural connections and influence as seen in music, dance, and literature. But perhaps the most well-known moment of political inspiration and solidarity is between the Black Panthers, the Chicano Brown Berets, and the Puerto Rican Young Lords. These connections existed throughout the US, but especially in cities like New York, Chicago, and LA. While it is essential to know this history, I also think it can be overblown at times. Sometimes in our effort to stress solidarity as a way kind of like, here's what we can do, right? This is the way forward. We tend to be celebratory and overlook the very real tensions and differences that do exist between our populations. But pretending those things don't exist is not going to actually lead us to, I think, genuine forms of solidarity and empowerment in building political capacity. We have to have the tools knowledge and capacity to really deal with those differences. Now, the final approach I wish to discuss is what Ricardo called co-imagining. So I thank him for that term. I had actually kind of been using that idea, but I didn't have a good way of explaining it. So thank you. Now, co-imagining is located in relational ethnic studies. Instead of focusing on differences and similarities between various groups, which is really the province of what we call comparative ethnic studies, relational ethnic studies explores how various groups impact and shape each other. This is a fundamental shift in how we study the relationships between non-white groups. Not only are Latinxes and African Americans shaped by white racism, but we also produce conditions, events, and discourses that impact each other. I'm interested in how brown and black communities have shaped each other through political struggle. In order to understand political struggle, we first need to start with political consciousness. Now, political consciousness is the precondition for activism. Political consciousness refers to such things as: how do people become aware of injustices? How do they interpret them? Who do they see as responsible? What are their proposed solutions? Who might they partner with? How and why do individuals come to believe that they should publicly act? And how do they make the transition from a private individual to a public activist? Thinking through these questions goes hand in hand with activism and shapes the nature of social movements. We are living in a time where political consciousness is shifting at this very moment, as a growing majority acknowledges that anti-Black racism exists. John Marquez, who teaches at Northwestern, argues that Latinx people's oppositional political consciousness draws heavily from the Black experience. He coined the term foundational Blackness to describe how Latinxes absorb a Black political consciousness. Whether consciously or not, we're influenced by the discourses, movements, frameworks, and strategies of African Americans and the larger Black radical tradition. I know this is true from my own personal experience, which I shared earlier, including things like Harriet Tubman, who is very much a part of the Black radical tradition. But of course, foundational Blackness exists on a massive scale, right? Not only certainly across the United States, but as well as other places around the globe as well. This is because anti-Blackness has shaped this place that we now call the US since the dawn of slavery, which was itself a global system. Well, there's no denying the importance of foundational Blackness. The exchange of political consciousness is actually a two-way street. Latinx people carry in us a deep history of anti-colonial struggle, class consciousness, anti-racist struggle, and resistance to authoritarian regimes and state genocide. We can call this a decolonial imaginary for short, borrowed from both Emma Perez and as well as Minolo. In order to better understand this dynamic, I decided to kind of make a list and map out these exchanges in the United States, or at least the continental United States. I made a list of all the different instances of radical political solidarity I could find between brown and Black people up to 2014. I identified about 150 instances of crossover between the two groups. Now, I want to be clear, this is not a comprehensive list of brown-Black solidarity. Not only did I miss some, but I also had a very limited kind of criteria. They had to be explicitly oppositional, as in, let's systematically challenge economic relations, racism, and other forms of domination. We have to change the whole power structure, right? Consequently, I excluded service providers, such as community groups involved in feeding hungry people, which is important, but I don't consider that to be, oppositional. I excluded electoral campaigns, with the exception of Jesse Jackson's 1980 campaign, which I really did feel to be quite an anomaly and not in any way, shape, or form a typical electoral campaign. I also excluded religious activities, which may often contain some level of political consciousness, although I think rarely are they oppositional in nature. I think one of the big examples of this would be Reverend Barber in North Carolina these days. And for many years, he was doing his Moral Mondays, and he's still, I think, organizing a major event in the coming week or so. So he has really done tremendous work, I think, in terms of building, multiracial kinds of formations. So I focus on very explicit, overt forms of oppositional struggle, ones in which historical connections can be found between movements and activists. When you start thinking about political activism and social movements in this way, history and racial lines quickly become murky. which is what I really want to do. I want to show how we shape each other. And if you recognize that we shape each other, not only do you realize the connections between racially subordinated peoples, but you begin to see the possibilities for continued collaboration. This is not meant to erase the distinctiveness of either group's experience, but to get us to think in more complicated terms, to think of us as co-imagining a future together. Sometimes we co-imagine in really bad ways, but sometimes, and oftentimes, we do it in really positive ways as well. Now, I identified 4 different forms. When I looked at all the data, I identified 4 different forms of exchange and solidarity. They are partial consciousness, borrowing, conscious collaboration, and multiracial organizations. Now, the first one is partial consciousness. This is a borrowing and or exchange that people are not always fully cognizant and aware of. Because they see each other regularly and often live in close proximity, ideas and practices spread between Black and brown peoples. And this is really important and can happen in numerous ways. Sometimes we are inspired by the actions of others. Sometimes, without any coordination, we create conditions that support each other's struggles. This often happens when communities face structurally similar circumstances, such as police abuse or environmental racism. Now, the 4th and final group category that I found was multiracial organizations. And these are organizations which decide that partnership is not enough and that they need to change their model to include others as well. And these may result through mergers, or they may develop after a history of formal collaboration, or even as kind of a next generation project. Typically, activists see the limitations of single group organizing, and this I think is especially common in big cities. In my work in Los Angeles, African Americans, I think as many Black activists, they feel their concerns get lost among multiracial organizations, and they need to have their own space in which their own issues and concerns can become prioritized. So in many ways, I think this is a big weakness we have seen from multiracial organizations, the larger kind of framing, right, of people of color in which African Americans feel their issues get subsumed in various kinds of ways by other groups. So I want you to keep these differences in mind as we look at these maps that I have. These show the distribution of co-imagining events from 1900 to 2014. Now, one of the things that quickly stands out is the importance of big cities. New York, LA, San Francisco clearly lead the way, and Chicago to a lesser extent. It really is in urban areas where this kind of intense cross-fertilization takes place. In cities, people are living in relatively close proximity. They're aware of what other groups are doing, and they're often in structurally similar positions, which greatly facilitates the possibility of exchange. So I would like to focus on one very important story, which I think shows a lot of historical loops, and that is Mendes versus Westminster. This is a very famous court case that focused on school segregation. In Orange County, which is now an LA suburb, Mexican children were segregated. The Westminster School District justified segregation because Mexican children supposedly did not speak English. In 1943, a group of parents with English-speaking children sued. The judge ruled, well, if you're segregating kids on the basis of language, well, then you got to administer them a language test, which would make sense. The school board did not like that because, of course, they didn't want any Mexican kids, regardless of language. So they appealed the decision. Now, this appeal attracted significant attention, including amicus briefs from the NAACP, the Japanese American Citizens League, the ACLU, and the American Jewish Congress, among others. Now, at this time, the Black civil rights organizations were not focused on desegregation. They were focused on trying to provide more resources to Black schools. The reason they did this is because courts had consistently ruled that racial segregation was legal, so they didn't think they had a legal foot to stand on. But in Mendes versus Westminster, they were challenging the very principle of segregation itself. The NAACP felt so strong about it that they sent Thurgood Marshall to help on the Mendes appeal. And ultimately, it was successful. The principle of segregation was ruled illegal because it denied Mexican children equal protection under the 14th Amendment. And this was the first major blow to legal segregation, and it led to the desegregation of California schools eventually. Of course, now they're resegregated for other reasons. But it also set the stage for Brown versus Board of Education. Robert Carter, an NAACP attorney, described Mendes, quote, as a dry run for the future. Thus, you can't fully understand Brown versus Board of Education without acknowledging Mendes. And you can't fully understand Mendes without acknowledging the NAACP, as well as the Japanese American Citizens League, American Jewish Congress, and other white allies. And this is what I mean when I talk about historical loops and co-imagining. Things are not so neat and tidy as one would appear as they would appear to be. The NAACP didn't know what the outcome would be, but they had the foresight and commitment to get involved in a Mexican struggle. So to wrap this up, my goal has been just to complicate how we think about Black and Brown relations. I want to be careful not to overstate histories and geographies of solidarity. I focus on these movements of political exchange because I think this is one of our best hopes for achieving racial justice. And I know that not all Latinxes and African Americans want to struggle together, but I know that there is a minority who do and are willing to cross those lines. And that is what we need to support, because that is how power is produced. And we desperately need that power to fight white supremacy as well as neoliberal capitalism.
Thank you so much, Laura. When you think about that moment, what are some of the strategies or the things that happened during that moment in terms of coalition building that you thought stuck out?
I was really struck with the centrality with which Black people consistently reached out to all other kinds of people. You know, when we think about the formation of the Chicano, of the Brown Berets, for example, in Los Angeles, the Black Panthers had just begun operating recently, and then there was a police killing in Avario. And what they did is they came and they joined a candlelight vigil. And based on that particular event then and that interaction, that's when the Brown Berets are born.
The question that I wanted to follow up with is, so much when we talk about race relations in the U.S., it boils down to, Black-white racial binary. And then when we think about activism, it focuses more on Black-brown activism. But what are kind of, how do we fit in, not even just Asian Americans, but also, Muslim Americans and Native Americans in these kind of like constellations of coalition and co-imagining? Are there any moments where, you've seen it really kind of stick out and pop, that there's been that type of, multiracial, beyond the Black-brown focus, solidarity and organizing?
Well, I think the immigrant rights movement has a lot of possibilities, right? That has been, because even though it is everyone, we are the majority of immigrants, of course, as Latinx people, but it affects all kinds of people, right? Certainly South Asians, Africans. There is a whole Black Immigrant Justice Alliance in Oakland, right? That works in partnership with many Latinx organizations. So I think immigrants is a really important one. I get concerned sometimes about some of the work of the Dreamers. Not that I don't support the Dreamers, because I do, but it's not sufficiently, I think, that's a privileged position by focusing just on Dreamers, right? In terms of they are like the good immigrants, right? And so we need to do a lot of work. And I think that's something that we need to be really taking the leadership on, to both highlight the diversity of immigration experiences, as well as challenging more, the good immigrant narrative.
So we have a question in the Zoom from, Elaine. And one of the things that they ask is, how can white organizing fit into this multiracial struggle for racial equity? And so I'm asking that, I'm even thinking that question just personally makes me think of the Young Patriots that were in coalition with the Young Lords and the Black Panthers in terms of forming the first Rainbow Coalition. How is your research, which I know is focused on activism of color, but how do you see, that radical white activism fitting into some of these projects or organizing?
In this particular moment, I think the most important thing for white people to do is to organize other white people. That is work that is not easy for people of color to do. It's much more difficult for us to do that. And that's what we need white allies doing more than anything else, is working with your white families, communities, to push them to understand the nature of white supremacy.
I think one of the things I want to ask is kind of pointing to some of your other work, right? Which is your current work, which is creating an atlas of foundational white supremacy. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I'm very interested in, I'm a geographer, I'm very interested in place. And I did this book with Laura Barraclough and Wendy Cheng called The People's Guide to LA. And it's like a radical tour guide that documents sites of racial, class, gender, and environmental struggle in LA County's history and landscape. And as I was doing it, so we focused on just on everyday vernacular landscapes and like, what were the stories of power and struggle associated with this bridge or with this beach or whatever it is. And then as I was doing this, I realized, well, what are all the things that the state chooses to actually commemorate? And if we think about what the state chooses to commemorate, that's a way of articulating a particular framework of the evolution and the history of the United States. What do we value, right? And what are the stories that we tell with it?
So I want to close out by once again thanking Laura so much for being here. We appreciate it so much. So give her your emojis, your hand claps, your care emojis, your hearts, all the reacts. And thank you so much, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad I was able to be here.
We are.
Take care, everyone. Fight on.
Yes.